Now, e-cigarettes are about as hot a topic as we could have in tobacco control. And so I'm glad that we can spend at least just a few minutes today giving this subject a little bit of an overview and discussing just some of the major points that are involved. Because, you know, when it comes to the subject, I spent the entire day yesterday in Washington, D.C. at something called the E-Cigarette Summit. The entire conference was about some of the issues that we're going to talk about here for 10 minutes. But, you know, we do serve as a resource. We're going to provide a list of some of the resources that we provide from the American Cancer Society at the end of the presentation, which you've received already. And there are many others as well. So we're always here to provide support and information, technical assistance, and so on. So, so going to that next slide, there are a lot of numbers, but a few of them are pretty key. And some of this is reflective of good news in tobacco control. It provides a little bit of a larger context because I think, as most of you, or if not all of you, understand very well, the 800-pound gorilla in the tobacco epidemic is cigarette smoking. It isn't e-cigarettes. E-cigarettes are key. They're something that we really need to address, especially when it comes to youth. But at least 98% of all tobacco-related deaths in the United States are caused by cigarette smoking alone. So and I think the proportionality here is always important for us to keep in the back of our minds, if not at the forefront. So what we know with adults, smoking declined from 20.9% in 2005 down to 15.5% in 2016. That's some millions of fewer smokers. And then to the current historic low, most recently recorded, of 14% in 2017. We'll have some new numbers later this year. So that reflects overall a 2/3 decline since 1965, which was the first year following that first landmark Surgeon General's report that was issued by Luther Terry, January of 1964. Now, when it comes to youth, in certain respects, kids are doing better than the rest of us. Smoking among high school students dropped from 15.8% in 2011 all the way down to 7.6% in 2016, although it did tick up a little bit again to 8.1%. Not a significant increase, but we are watching that very closely, particularly coincident to the fact, as you see here, and I'm sure you all know, e-cigarette use skyrocketed among high school students as well as middle school students, by the way, between 2017 and 2018, so by 78%. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, please. So what about e-cigarettes? What are they? I think you all have a pretty good idea, but just briefly, let's take a look at this. E-cigarettes are not a single thing by any means. In fact, there are a whole lot of things that come under this heading of so-called e-cigarettes. They're devices of many kinds that heat a liquid called different things into an aerosol. It's commonly referred to as vapor. The concern from our health perspective is, of course, that this is not water vapor, which vapor kind of connotes. It is a word that is used now, and that train's left the station. Vaping is what this is. That was industry generated from the beginning, but in any case, technically speaking, it's an aerosol. It's inhaled by the user, and it contains nicotine almost always. When you talk about Juul, for example, every Juul contains nicotine. Kids don't always know that. Plus various flavorings. That, of course, is a key issue that the FDA is looking at, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding because of the impact that flavors can have on enticing kids to use them. And by the way, a critical feature of that involves marketing. It isn't even necessarily that flavors are there, although that matters, but how they're presented in appealing ways to kids. And then there's some other additives that can have some health effects, pulmonary effects, and potentially others. Again, e-cigarettes look like a whole lot of different things. They look like conventional cigarettes. They can look like cigars and pipes and pens. Of course, the USB flash drive look like Juul and some other copycat products, and then other forms as well. Next slide. So when it comes to what has now been characterized as an epidemic of e-cigarette use among youth. We know that a lot more kids use e-cigarettes than conventional tobacco cigarettes. Last year, again, e-cigarette use by teens jumped 78%. It is now over 20% of all high school seniors in the United States. That's compared to about 2.8% for adults, somewhat higher among men, a little bit lower for women, but averaging at 2.8. But that isn't to say that adult use is insignificant, because there are a whole lot more adults than there are kids. And so the most recent data indicate that nearly 8 million adults are using e-cigarettes in the US. And one of the major issues here, and we'll touch on this again, is that too many are dual or even poly using e-cigarettes with other tobacco products, which can and does perpetuate the harm of using those more harmful products. Next slide. So the bottom line on the risks of e-cigarettes for kids and teens and young adults, first of all, e-cigarettes are not safe for anyone. But again, I'm going to say parenthetically, we always have to remember, proportionality here. They're not the same as combustible or burned cigarettes. Anyway, most e-cigarettes contain nicotine. Again, every jewel contains nicotine. It's highly addictive. It can potentially harm adolescent brain development, which continues well into the mid-20s. Using nicotine in adolescence can also harm the parts of the brain that control attention and learning and mood and impulse control. Nicotine is correlated with a higher incidence of ADHD, for example. They do contain other harmful substances in addition to nicotine. And young people who use e-cigarettes are at increased risk. We don't have a causal connection yet, but there's clearly an association between young people using e-cigarettes and smoking combustible cigarettes down the line. Next slide. So big question for us, of course, focusing on cessation, is do e-cigarettes help people quit smoking? There are 7 FDA-approved medications to help people quit. And of course, there are quit lines, which when used are highly effective, and counseling, which we know the evidence shows when combined with the use of medications can make a big difference. For those individuals who either can't or won't try to quit by using the approved medications, the American Cancer Society encourages them to completely then switch, if they're interested in using e-cigarettes or using them, to completely switch from regular cigarettes to e-cigarettes, but with the ultimate goal of quitting all tobacco products, including e-cigarettes. That takes into account that there's very likely a real transition period that's involved. We know that. We're not saying do it overnight, but we do hold that out as the ultimate goal. And it's important to stress again that the dual use of e-cigarettes and tobacco cigarettes perpetuates the harms of smoking. So dual use is not helpful while it's taking place, but it may be helpful in terms of helping someone move along the way by way of transition to ultimately not using. Next slide. So e-cigarettes are not currently approved by the FDA as aids to help stop smoking. No e-cigarette company has submitted any of their products for review by the FDA for health and safety and efficacy. The research findings about e-cigarette use for cessation have been mixed, and some studies show that they may be about as helpful as NRT without counseling, but we do have now, and I have added this and just wanted to note that we've just changed this today, so we'll send you out this updated version of these slides later. A recent well-designed randomized control trial, which is the best way of assessing this, for e-cigarettes and quitting, revealed that e-cigarettes were nearly twice as effective as NRTs. And look, I mean, this is the science. Unfortunately, they're not regulated. Not every product is going to be identical to another, but this is what was found here with a lot of test subjects. But again, bearing in mind that the absolute success rates for both were low, unfortunately, less than 10% for use of NRTs and less than 20% for e-cigarettes. But in any case, clearly more clinical research is needed, and it is going on. In terms of, this is going to be just a little redundant, but I wanted to highlight the American Cancer Society's official position statement on e-cigarettes that we published. It's on cancer.org. We put up in February of last year, which again found that research to date has found that vaping e-cigarettes is less harmful than smoking combustible cigarettes, but that less harmful does not mean safe. And again, most e-cigarettes, including all Juuls, contain nicotine and other chemicals, and we don't know the long-term effects yet because we haven't had a long-term yet. Next slide. And no young person should ever use any tobacco product, including e-cigarettes. Adult smokers are urged to quit using the FDA-approved cessation medications and add counseling. And at the same time, and this is really the somewhat more cutting-edge approach to this issue, clinicians should support any attempt to quit, including with their patients or clients who are using e-cigarettes, but again, with the ultimate goal of quitting all products eventually. Next slide. So strong federal regulation is needed. The FDA has authority over all of this. This is an ongoing a daily focus, and from ACS's end, our affiliate, our advocacy affiliate, the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, is working on the ground directly with FDA to encourage it to act on its authority over e-cigarettes more assertively. We do need them to restrict the marketing of these products to youth and prohibit flavors that appeal to youth. Also enforce the prohibition on unsubstantiated health claims, since there's been an awful lot of misinformation out there. And then, of course, to use sound scientific evidence when evaluating the kinds of applications that the FDA receives from industry related to the health impact of their products. And the FDA is also in the business of proposing product standards for the protection of public health. And one very big one I'll just note as an example is they are pursuing the potential for ordering the cigarette manufacturers to reduce nicotine in their products to non-addictive levels, which would, if successful, bode extremely well for public health, because essentially, almost no one smokes cigarettes without nicotine. Okay, next slide. At the state and local level, where many of you, of course, are very active, state and local government has authority over this as well, and e-cigarettes should be defined as tobacco products as they are at the federal level. And by the way, the simple reason for that is while e-cigarettes don't contain tobacco, they contain nicotine, which is derived from tobacco. And in a court decision a few years ago, it was determined that the FDA would regulate e-cigarettes as tobacco products as long as they are not being marketed as cessation products and submitted to the FDA for review specifically for that purpose. I know this is all a little bit complex, but what states and local governments can do is, and should do, is to include e-cigarette use vaping in all smoke and tobacco-free policies. They can tax all tobacco products, including e-cigarettes, and of course raise the minimum age of sale of all tobacco products, including e-cigarettes, to 21. There's new legislation that's just been introduced in Congress as well to do that at the national level. And I think many of you are familiar, and some of your states are covered by some of the new Tobacco 21 laws. Local and state and local government can also prohibit the sale of unregulated flavored e-cigarettes and e-cigarette liquid, and also include e-cigarettes in tobacco sales and marketing restrictions. And then there's more. So there's a lot of authority at all levels of government to help address these issues. Next slide. So this is just a list of a few select resources that we have online. The first one, I'll just note, what do we know about e-cigarettes, is basically a simple FAQ, and it's meant for the lay public to understand some of the issues that we've been talking about today. Our official position statement, which has more sort of clinically oriented recommendations that I've been discussing, is also online. And then we have a very recent publication out which addresses a number of approaches to the primary prevention of cancer, but we do have a section there which provides a little bit more detail, which you may find interesting. It's only 3 pages in this journal piece related to tobacco products and e-cigarettes in particular. So I commend that to your attention as a resource as well. So I think that's it, and happy to discuss any of these issues, with respect to any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Cliff. And as he mentioned, there was a kind of last-minute change to the presentation, so I will send it out again, the link to the slides after our echo today, so that you can have the latest in Didactic. I know, because the big question was, do e-cigarettes help people stop smoking? So that's the part that got expanded a little bit. Okay, Cliff, we have one question. Are youth able to purchase e-cigarettes so easily because the law hasn't caught up yet in some geographies, or is it an enforcement issue?
The simple answer, and that's a good question, thank you for that, is that it's a question of enforcement. Enforcement and compliance, because e-cigarettes are not legal to purchase for those under 18 anywhere, as far as I'm aware. And an increasing number of places at the state level and in hundreds of local governments, the age has actually been increased to 21, and those measures include e-cigarettes with them. So that requires multiple steps can be taken to ensure that there's enforcement of that. The FDA contracts with every state, I think, in the country to ensure that they have enforcement regimens that do that. And then in terms of local community norms and pressure, if that's observed, folks can also be in touch with local establishments, and can even bring media attention when needed. But that's a serious issue, and it's getting better, but there's certainly a long way to go.